me say the Mama Podcast?
Mama Podcast.
Hi Mama, you're listening to the Mama Podcast. It's Sumaya here, the co-founder of Mama Emmy app. Mama Emmy is the first app to exclusively connect mothers across the Middle East, connect with like-minded mamas and creates lifelong friendships. At Mama, we are all about connecting mamas to empower women. So let's join together and make this mission a reality. Thank you so much, Akhila, for joining me. I've got the wonderful Akhila from Indigrow Kids today with me, and we're going to talk all about culture and raising children and all of the fun stuff. But before we get into any of that, I'd love for you to just sort of introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about what Indigrow Kids is, and everything you can about your little journey to get to where Indigrow Kids is now.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you for having me here. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be asked to kind of connect and chat and tell you a bit more about our journey. So basically, Indigrow is a company that makes multicultural books and games for little kids all over the world. That's what we do in a nutshell. But we basically started about 2 years ago. My co-founder and I, Shama, who's based in Singapore, so Indigrow is a Singapore-based company. She's Indian like me. We've been friends for 20 years. And she ended up in Singapore with her South African husband and is now raising her half Indian, half South African child in Singapore. And around the time that she was pregnant, she started to kind of look around and say, how, you know how it is when you're pregnant, you kind of have these dreams of how you want to raise your child, this idea of what the kind of world that you want to kind of create for your little one that you're bringing into the world. And at that point, she had this idea of connecting her child back to her roots, but in a kind of, at the same time, being very clear about raising a global child, a child who's part of all cultures, especially in Singapore, being such a melting pot. And she looked around for tools and resources that would help her do that. And there wasn't much that she could find. And especially being Indian, there was a lot of mythology or religion-based content that was out there. So then she reached out to me and she said, I have a background in early childhood education, worked with kids 0 to 8 all my life. And that's when she reached out to me and said, would you be willing to come on board and help me create something like this? And I, of course, leaped at the opportunity because having grown up in India as well, we've grown up with books and games and toys, like Julia Donaldson, Eric Carle, Dr. Seuss. I mean, they're all fabulous material and fabulous content, educational content for little kids. But in terms of providing cultural context for a little child, there was lacking. I remember growing up as a child seeing yellow ducks in books. And in India, you can try as hard as you want. You will never see a yellow duck in India. It just does not exist. And I remember going to the park and saying, but where are the yellow ducks? And that's the thing, right? For children, they want to see, they need to see representation. They need to see themselves in the books, the games, the songs, the media that they're using. And that was basically the idea behind Indigrow. We started with this concept of how do you connect a child to their roots. How do you connect? We believe very strongly that children need both mirrors and windows in the world. So a mirror where they kind of see themselves and this is who I am and this is what this represents me, as well as a window into what else is out there, what other cultures are out there, how does it work, how does it function. And so we started our journey about 2 years ago. We started with 2 collections of India. We've just launched our Singapore collection, and this year 2021 we're hoping to add more to the library, so to speak. Yeah,
that's exciting. I'm just going to take you a few steps back. You talked a little bit about how children will look for things that in their real world that they see inside books. So you gave the example of the yellow duck. Maybe a child is in an environment where they may see the yellow duck, but you're introducing different cultures. So is the idea that you are introducing lots of different things to them so they see a variety of different things, and so it doesn't matter where they're based, they'll see something in the book that will be relatable?
Yeah. So I read this thing the other day where it said people and cultures are the same all over the world. And I also read people and cultures are different all over the world. And it's so interesting because both statements are absolutely true, right? And I think that's what we're trying to bring in. The fact is that when we introduce a book to your child, when you introduce games to your child, when you introduce content to your child, immediately the way in which a child's brain starts to develop is that what are the similarities and what are the differences? And they recognize both of them. A child as young as 2 years of age starts to notice cultural differences. A child as young as 6 months of age starts to notice racial differences.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so whether you're introducing it or not, your child is already observing. It's already absorbing and making their own connotations of the world in which they live and the things that they see around them. So their brain is processing and making sense of it. Right. So they will notice it as similarities and differences. So a child who sees the yellow duck will say, hey, yes, oh, we have yellow ducks too. A child who doesn't have yellow ducks will say, we don't have yellow ducks. But they will both sit and appreciate the similarity and the difference. And that's where culture comes in. That's where diversity comes in. Diversity is simply understanding. I mean, the fact is diversity exists.
Right.
That's a fact. Right? What we're trying to say is that how do we make it inclusive?
Sure, which is what we all want, really.
Exactly. So that's the hope. That's the idea. When you're introducing your child to content, whatever that form of content that may be, it's either something that they're already familiar with, or it's something that is new.
Right.
In both cases, they have something to learn. They have something to kind of compare and contrast. They have a conversation to start. They have an observation to make. They have an idea or a thought that develops.
Right. And so your products aren't necessarily just because at the moment you've got the Singapore and the India collection. So it's not just for children from an Indian background or a background from Singapore. Is that correct? It is to introduce different cultures to all children.
The idea is that, so obviously if you are of Indian origin, or if you are of Singapore origin, then the cultures will have a bit more of meaning for you, because there will be things that you relate to, your parents, your grandparents, etc. There are a lot more stories and anecdotes that kind of come into it. But we've also seen that children don't necessarily need to be from a particular culture to appreciate the other culture. And for us, the idea is that the world is getting smaller, if anything, right? We're not raising our children in silos. We're not the 3-year-old today, the 4-year-old today, when they go to school, they're meeting different children from different parts of the world, maybe different parts of the country, whatever it is, but they're meeting different people. And I think that's what we're trying to say. We're trying to say that everybody is different, and let's celebrate those differences. And one way of teaching your child to celebrate those differences is by bringing in, diversifying their playroom, basically.
All the previous stories and all the ones that you mentioned are of a very specific culture, and I guess because it's more widespread, so you're just trying to diversify what's on in the library at home, which is incredible, because you're introducing different concepts to a child from a younger age. How young or how soon should you introduce these things? And so when do your products sort of start, and how soon should you introduce these products to the children? Would you feel is appropriate?
So we actually, so our products are, we start 0+, right? So we have these beautiful flashcards that are, as pretty much as soon as a baby can grasp, it's made for them. So we have a beautiful baby and toddler range as well. But we've had moms who read to their children. We have songs that people have listened to, prenatal. So the idea being that it's if you think about it, right? People listen to Mozart and Beethoven, and when your babies are in the stomach, right? There's this whole research-based analysis on how music helps develop the baby. And what we're saying is, why restrict yourselves, right? Open yourselves out, world music, listen to all kinds of music, bring in culture. I don't think that there is a particular point in time. There is no, and this is what I was saying, at 6 months of age, a child starts to notice differences. At 2 years of age, they start to recognize cultural differences. At 3.5, they'll start to express it. right? At 3.5 in a play school, we've had a child who was half Indian, half Swiss, and they were like, why am I white? I'm Indian, but all my friends are brown. And that's at 3 years of age. So children have a very natural curiosity about the world around them. They have a very natural curiosity about the things that they see around them, the books that they read. And we cannot afford to be blind about it anymore. We have to address it. I think that there was a whole generation that would shush children up every time we asked an uncomfortable question.
Right.
And what we're saying is, let's not shush them up. Let's bring those questions up front and center, because those questions are what help them understand the world, help them make sense of the world, and grow up to be more empathetic and kind.
I mean, I love that. I think that's incredible, because it's, if we start those conversations at an early age, will we see change and impact the future generations, which I think is really incredible. What we find now is, obviously, because we're also multicultural and, we are living in this world which is global, there's so many different cultures living together. What we often find is the children that we have now of a different culture to their grandparents. What I find is challenging for some parents, and this is obviously just from my personal experience and experience of like friends around me, is that sometimes they really struggle to get their children to understand their grandparents' culture, maybe because some of their culture has been lost or bits of their culture has been retained. And so it's just that conversation. And I guess my question is, how can we make that communication easier between grandparents and children? And also, how can we get them to appreciate that actually this is like ultimately that these are their roots?
Yeah, so I think, that was honestly one of the first questions that we kind of asked ourselves when we got onto this journey. And for us, everything is about the child. So when you look at it from the child's perspective, the first thing that you look at is, how does a child learn best? And the answer is play. Right? Play is what brings it all alive. It's how they form their connections. It's how the whole world kind of comes together for them. And especially in the early years, their sense of how does one connect to the other, whether it's stories or it's games or even it's their senses, that constant sense of exploration that they have, it's all stems from play. And so what we wanted to do was that we wanted to create a way in which grandparents and grandchildren can play together. So for example, in our Indian collection, we have these memory cards, and we actually pitch it saying that let the grandparents and the grandchildren play together, because what happens when they play together is that, one, of course, that it creates this bond and this uniqueness, this way for a grandparent to engage. The memory game is very simple. There's nothing much to it. You're just kind of trying to find like for like and matching things. But more than that, what we are creating is touch points. We're creating touch points for conversation. So in our Indian collection, for example, you'll have a picture of an auntie driving an auto, or, there's a little boy eating a gola, which is like a snow cone, or somebody else who's a Kathakali dancer. And what we found multiple different times is that the grandparents then said, hey, you know what? When I was small, this is what used to happen. Or when I traveled here, I went there. And the anecdotes start to come out, and their personal stories start to come out. And that for us is the power of play and the power of connection. But that only happens when you provide a touch point, when you provide a conversational point. And that conversational point comes through play. And it comes through having multiple different ways, right? So that's why for us, the way we look at it, a book is not enough, because a book is a one-time thing. You read it and you put it away. It may not always be picked up the other time around, because children need, and you would have seen this with your kids as well, the familiarity of it. A child will come to you saying, I want to read the same book over and over again. And we, as adults, we go, oh my God, how many times? Like, enough now, we've read this book 20 times already. Can we move to another book? But what we don't realize is that for the child, every single time that they're reading, there's something new that they're absorbing. There's some new connection that they're forming. There's one more little detail that kind of settles down and that they make sense of, and then they're remembering. And so what we've done is, when we create memory cards and we create a giant floor puzzle and we create a song, and then it's almost like when you fill up the playroom with that, and then you bring in the parents and the grandparents and the uncles and the aunts and whoever happens to be dropping by, the family, friends, right? And the conversational touch points that start to emerge from that, it allows for the child to pick up from each of their experiences. It allows for the conversations, that connection that you get formed, and you can actually deep dive further into that culture, because you're revisiting constantly and comparing and contrasting different stories, different anecdotes, and different experiences. And that's what your child is absorbing.
I guess the triggers for the adults, in terms of, it's a trigger for a conversation, it's a trigger for a memory, because sometimes as adults we forget all of the things that we experienced and all of the different things that actually make us who we are, and to remember those and then to be able to tell those stories to a child is pretty challenging, unless you're writing it down in a book, and then, like, if you've got a diary maybe that you're reading. But this is an incredible way to even trigger those memories for the adult to then be able to portray to the child. I think it's an amazing way to bring up that.
It makes it easier, at some level for the grandparents, because for the grandparents, what happens is that this, it's tough for them, right? Because they have to kind of put themselves into the grandchild's shoes. Right. And that's not an easy thing to do. When we say generational challenges, of course there are generational challenges. The world has evolved. The world is not the same place that it was 5-10 years ago. Forget how it used to be when they were children. So there's a huge gap in how they kind of play, how kids play, the kind of toys they play with, everything. And it can be a bit intimidating for a grandparent to say, okay, how do I connect to my grandchild? And so the minute you kind of bring them that little bit of, like you said, the trigger or the touch point, that similarity, and again, that's it, right? It's about, even for the grandparent and the grandchild, realizing that there are similarities into how their childhood versus my childhood, and how can we link those up together, and through the form of play, that's how it makes a difference.
It's incredible for the grandchild, but it's also amazing for the grandparent. They must feel so it's such an inclusive way of playing. Just this tiny silly example, but a very small example, like VHS tapes is something that we had when we were younger, which is no longer a thing, and we get excited. I remember this was like, when we were. And imagine if you're in your 50s or 60s and you're able to bring conversations just because your grandchild is playing with something that is similar or has got a picture that depicts something that they did when they were younger. It must be so heartwarming for the grandparent.
Absolutely. But having said that, that's also why you need to, and we've given a lot of thought about it, is how do you keep it current? How do you keep it contemporary? Because that's the other challenge that you face, because stuff that, we might have found exciting, children today, because of the stimulation that they get or the kind of exposure that they have, for them it's boring, it's fuddy-duddy, it's too slow. So right. How do you retain the elements of nostalgia and what the essence of what, the cultural, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the food, the fun aspects of it, while keeping it delightful and fun and contemporary and relevant for the kids? And that balance, I think, is what makes the difference again.
You gifted me and sent me some of your products, and honestly, it has the most modern feeling ever. Yeah. It's an incredible thing to open. The packaging is amazing. It definitely feels modern. And also the illustrations are incredible inside the product, on the products and inside the books as well, because you've really gone for this very modern, clean aesthetic, which really helps, because that's what we see around us nowadays. And it's important that, it fits into what is normal right now, because like you said, if it felt dated or if it looked dated, then it's hard to get a child to engage with.
Absolutely, because it has to be relevant to them. And that's for us when we said, the child is at the center of it. If it's not fun for the child, if it's not playful for the child, then you're not going to get the reaction, because I think that's the problem with culture throughout the years and the generations. We've tried to kind of force feed it down onto children. This is how, and culture can be very intimidating, and whether it's Indian culture or any other ethnic cultures, right? There's a certain rule book almost that you need to follow. This is what you need to do, this is how you must behave, this is what you must wear, this is what you must eat. And there are these kind of this unwritten code of conduct when it comes to culture, and which naturally as children, and even we've rebelled against it, growing up, like, no, you can't make me do that. And I think that what we're trying to say is that, yes, there is this idea of culture that used to be prevalent, but culture is so much more than that, right? And when we say that we're a sum total of our culture, it's not one culture, right? It's not like you may be Indian origin, but you're living in the UAE, you grew up in Britain, that you're an amalgamation of all the different people and all the different environments that you've ever kind of been exposed to.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to say, is that culture is so much, it's the everydayness of it. It's
Right.
not something, I don't think that we can refer to culture anymore or diversity anymore as a section on the shelf in a bookstore. It's part of your everyday life, whether you accept it or not. It is part of your everyday life.
And so that brings me onto this thought that if we introduce culture from a younger age, do you think that would, and obviously this is more probably an opinion more than, maybe there is science behind this, maybe you know what the science is behind this, but could it reduce prejudice in the world? Do you feel that actually the future generation would benefit from it from a perspective of understanding different cultures and therefore reducing prejudice?
100%. I don't think that you even need stacks of data to support this, right? It's simple conversations. Your 3-year-old is going to school. She may be eating, say, a khichdi at home, or a fried fish, or sushi, or whatever it is that she's eating at home. And then she goes to school and there's a plate of couscous that's been served to her, right? And just this idea of, ew, I don't want to eat this couscous, or, somebody else passing a comment on the food that she's eating. If you've had a conversation with your child before about the fact that there are different people in the world who eat different things, we eat this at home, but they eat that, it automatically, the conversation changes. She'll go to school and she'll be like, hey, that's interesting. What are you eating? Instead of feeling they've left out, or oh, my mama also makes something like this at home, but it's different. Mine is sweet, yours is sour, right? It's this idea of being able to connect, to have that conversation, to teach them that, yes, people are different, but they're also similar. That, yes, I may eat, khichdi at home, he may eat couscous at home, but we both like to play ball.
Right, absolutely.
Right? How do you teach your child to connect on the similarities while being accepting of the differences? That's the ultimate goal, right? And that only comes when you start these conversations early. Where, you can't get a child to high school and then say, oh, now let's talk about acceptance, right? At teenage levels, they're already starting to go through their own issues and their own journeys of self-acceptance, peer group, the conversations. Everybody knows how hard it is for a teenager in today's world, notwithstanding social media. So if we start these conversations that we are who we are, we are a sum total of everything that comes into our lives. And you learn to be comfortable in your own skin. You learn to be curious and kind and empathetic at a young age. These are all skills that hold you.
Right, absolutely.
And I don't think there's a starting age for that.
I think if the earlier, I totally agree with you. I just wanted your perspective on the conversation, where if you can introduce it early, then that can only be a good thing. 100% agree with you. It also gives them the opportunity to understand and, like you said, be curious about different cultures and say, actually, I like that about that culture. I'm going to take that on as something I want to do as well. And actually, I dislike that about my culture and I don't want to take that. And that's okay too. And I guess if you're open to having these conversations from a young age, then as they grow older, then they'll be open to having those conversations with you as a...
Yeah, and I think that the idea also is that, as children grow, the more global the village that we live in, right? It's a global village. And I think that we're all doing a lot in terms of it. I think if you think about it from a takeout perspective, right? Everybody's like, oh, my child loves sushi and my child loves the Korean barbecue, and oh, we get an Indian curry every night for takeout, etc. So in that sense, that yes, we are opening ourselves up. There is a lot more out there, but I think that the danger that happens a little bit, and that's something that as parents that we need to be a bit more aware of, is that we tend to kind of portray cultures very unidimensionally. I think there was this quote that said the danger of a single story, and I think that that's where tools like this, which introduce culture through in all its diversity, where it's about the food, it's the smells, it's the sounds, it's the clothes, it's everything packaged in this beautiful story and play format that allows a child to kind of see it from all angles. And I think that's also important, because we do have conversations where we're like, oh, but my child knows Japanese culture, but because we order sushi. And I think that little awareness in terms of what else can I do? How else can I infuse diversity and culture into my everyday world? And for us, the obvious solution is through play.
I mean, I absolutely love that. Now everything is encouraged through play anyway, because obviously there's so much data and research to suggest that that's how children, like you said earlier, make connections, and that's how they actually learn. Even things as simple as the alphabet and the numbers, they do through play. If you look at how they teach them, I mean, you're an early years educator, so you know this, but everything's done through play, and there's a reason for that. And I think that's incredible that you're introducing something as big as culture through the perspective of play. Also, it's so well thought through.
The developmental need of the child at every stage. So when we say 0 to 8, obviously a 2-year-old is very different from what a 4-year-old needs, is very different from what an 8-year-old needs, right? Each of the stages that they're in. So we have the story, which is like the main, the hero. The book, it's the central part of it. But then we have these connecting elements. So say, for example, you're a mom who's reading the story to your toddler, right? And or your baby and things like that. And your child is sitting in your lap. And there's that whole connection that is formed between parent and child, the tone of your voice, the way in which you're reading the story, the language, the vocabulary, the little giggling that happens when you're looking at the illustrations. And all of these are, they're very, very powerful connections that your baby is forming in their brain at this point, because it's rooted in that safety and security of that adult-child connection. But as they start to grow, there's also the sense of self that starts to develop. There's a sense of, I want to do it myself. And now a book at that point may not necessarily be the easiest thing, or developmentally, they may not be ready to turn the pages and look at it themselves. And so we created these little flashcards that have the same images that are there in the book. But the reason that it works is because they're now going back, the images in the flashcards triggers their memory of reading the book with you. It triggers that same feeling of emotional connect, that social dependence that they have, that security that they get from their adult in their life, the caregiver in their life, and they transfer that onto the flashcards, and then they start to interact with the flashcards in their own way. And it kind of it again, it's talking about that providing that familiar context, that familiarity of it all. So they look at the flashcards, and then there's another thought, there's another idea that kind of connects. And that's just at the 0 to 2 level. Then as they go to 3 years old, they start to get a bit more social. They want to now start, rather than playing alongside somebody, they want to start playing with somebody. They want to play with their siblings or with their peer group. And that's where we created these memory cards, like we talked about earlier, or to play with their grandparents, because that's when the social interaction need comes in, that developmental need to connect, right, with somebody outside of their immediate unit. And then we have these beautiful giant floor puzzles, which again, as they get older, at 4.5, 5 years of age, it's about, being able to complete a task on their own, because they're looking for that sense of achievement. They're looking for that sense of aha, I can do
Right.
this, right? This sense of sitting down patiently, focus, attention span, all of these things. So these are all their developmental needs. And we kind of brought it all together while keeping the images similar so that that familiarity and that kind of context stays the
That's
same.
amazing. Where's the best place listeners can find you, and how do they connect with you as well?
So all our products are available on www.indigrowkids.com. We ship to the UAE. We're also on Instagram. You can at Indigrow Kids. So, at any point in time, reach out, say hi, drop us a message. We're happy to reply.
And you've got so much content on your website and Instagram as well, where you share so many sort of tips and details as well. So it's definitely worth having a look. I will put both of those into the show notes so that it's easy for the listeners to find you as well. Any last final comments? Do you want to add anything that we may have missed?
The only one thing that I would say is that I think just to reiterate that it's never too early to start.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Akhila, for joining me. It's been an incredible conversation. I know we could have talked about this for so much longer, but I'm conscious of the fact that you're a very, very busy woman and I want to let you get on with the rest of the day, but maybe we can get you back for a more sort of specific topic and we can definitely talk about that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.